All right, we're thanking those that are joining us. We're just waiting for other people to join the presentation. We're not sure if they're coming in through a different way and they can't get in or not, but we'll figure that out as we go along. And we do thank those who are able to come out and attend. And this will be, of course, it's recorded. It just started the recording. So this is going to be on our Facebook page. And Russ is really good about doing this pretty quick. So I'll start my video. Did you want me to start, Russ, and you can let people in as we go? Oh, you're muted.
Yes, let's do that. And I'll let people in as they come.
Okay, all right. Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone that has joined us and those who will join us later through our recording of this presentation. And this is part of our Keswick Ridge Historical Society annual History Speaks series. For the last couple of years, we have done it through Zoom. Before that, we had many years of experience doing it in person. But of course, we know what the last 2 years been like, so we're doing it in Zoom, but it also allows us to reach out to a larger audience of people because we can record them and make it available. My name is Evelyn, and I'm a member of the Keswick Ridge Historical Society. I'm currently serving as the curator and treasurer, and I'm going to be your moderator today. And today we are very pleased to welcome our guest speakers, Dr. Michael Boudreau and Dr. Bonnie Huskins, to hear their presentation on, get the title right here, Just the Usual Work, the Social Worlds of Ida Martin, Working Class Diarist in St. John. And our presentation today is going to be followed by a question period. And if you have any questions during the presentation, please write them in the chat. It's usually at the bottom of your screen, somewhere in the middle. And at the end, I will pass the questions on in chat in the order that they've come in. And just a few words on our Zoom etiquette. Please leave your microphones on mute during the presentation. As I said, put all your questions in chat. Once we run out of questions in chat, we will open it up for people to speak questions. And if you're in a distracting environment, like I usually am with cats and everything else, please turn off your camera so as not to distract from the presentation. And this talk is being recorded, and you can share it with your friends that have missed it. It will be posted to our website and Facebook page in a couple of days, usually before. And don't forget to like us on Facebook and learn about all of our upcoming events and projects. And we're always looking for new members. It's an exciting society to join. We're very busy, we're very active, and what we're doing is very important to the community. So with further ado, I will introduce our guest speakers. We have two today, and it is, as I said earlier, Dr. Michael Boudreau and Dr. Bonnie Huskins. Now, Dr. Boudreau is a professor of criminology and criminal justice at St. Thomas University. He is currently researching executions in New Brunswick from 1869 to 1957, and he has published articles on the botched execution of Benny Swim in 1922 in Woodstock. Dr. Boudreau is the editor of the Journal of New Brunswick Studies, and find the link to that. I'll find it, I'll post it in chat, but it's got some great articles. I've used them and I've read a lot of them. Now, Dr. Bonnie Huskins is the author of several articles and book chapters on loyalists and sociability, and the British engineer William Booth, and this including the story mats. And she wrote the introduction to A Changed Heart, Romance, Suspense, and Murder in 19th Century St. John, a novel by May Agnes Fleming. Dr. Huskins is currently preparing a book-length manuscript on William Booth, and she teaches courses on the history of Atlantic Canada and the British Atlantic world, and Canadian women's history, the Loyalist, and piracy in world history. And this is at St. Thomas and the University of New Brunswick. So This presentation, as I said earlier, just the usual work, the social worlds of Ida Martin, working class diarist in St. John, is going to discuss the diaries of Ida Martin, which she kept faithfully from 1945 to 1992, and her social worlds, including her family, her faith, working class family economy, cars and trucks, aging and widowhood, and political engagement. It's going to be an exciting presentation, and I'm going to turn it now over to Dr. Boudreau and Dr. Huskins.
Well, thank you so much for inviting us. We're really happy to be here. We're very happy to talk about our book. And we've just heard, and it's very good news, that it's been nominated for the New Brunswick, shortlisted for the New Brunswick Writers Federation Award for Nonfiction. So we're delighted by that. We thought we would start by talking just a little bit about the Diarist and the diaries. And since this is essentially May Day, or International Workers' Day, we thought for our presentation today, we would focus in more on labor and work, as opposed to some of the other social worlds. But we're more than happy to talk about all of them. If there are those of you who have read the book already and have questions about that. So maybe we could have one of the pictures of Ida and her husband. And yeah, here we go. This is a picture of Ida in later life with her husband, Alan Robert Martin, or AR, as he's known in the diaries. So Ida was born in 1907 in the vicinity of Sussex. According to her daughter, she lived in farms of all kinds throughout the region of Sussex. Her dream in life was to be a nurse, but she wasn't able to get the funding together to go to Boston to train as a nurse. So what she did was she worked as a telephone operator instead for a while in Westfield, and then eventually married AR. And they had one daughter, Barbara, who is my mother. That, I guess, is the big reveal that we're more than happy to talk about. These are the diaries of my maternal grandmother. So how does an historian, professional historian, deal with the personal when trying to write history? So we're more than happy to talk about that in the question period. So she marries, as I mentioned, married AR. They had one daughter, Barbara, who I'm really sorry to say passed away just before Christmas. So this is essentially, this book and this whole project is dedicated to not only AR and Ida, but to my mother, Barbara. Now, just as the war was breaking out, they moved to St. John, New Brunswick, where they lived on the Lower West Side. They eventually bought a ramshackle house, and you see it in that picture, and worked for most of their lives fixing up that house. That was a great deal of pride for them. And that house became the center of a number of family and friends in terms of these various sociability networks. She worked a little bit outside of the home, but was primarily a homemaker for most of her life. She started to write diaries in 1945 and kept them very religiously until she was quite elderly. And she can no longer write them. So essentially she became too frail to write. Now, one of the interesting things in the diaries, maybe we could show a picture of the diaries. I'm just going to show you a picture of the diaries here. The diaries that she wrote in were 5-year diaries, and they're very interesting to work with. They're what we call account book diaries. So there's only about 4 lines per day that she fills with information. Sometimes she used every little piece of space in the diaries to write what she decided to write for that day. They're very interesting artifacts to work with. They work across so that you have Monday in 1 year, and then you turn the page Tuesday, Wednesday, and then when that year is over, you go all the way back to the beginning and start again. So January 30th, 31st, and so on. So that when you're at the end of the 5-year period, we do have evidence that Ida Martin looked up and saw what she had written 5 years ago and actually made a few editing changes, which is kind of interesting. We usually think of diaries as our innermost feelings shared that particular moment, but she was definitely editing as she went on. So these are very interesting diaries to work with, as I mentioned. They're minimalist in terms of the kind of information that you might expect. They're not introspective. She doesn't share a lot of feelings, but there are ways in which emotion does occur. And we can talk about that again if you would like. So as I mentioned, she kept them for many years until the 1980s. And the last thing that I'll mention before we move on to some of the work that's contained in the diaries is toward the end, when she was becoming too frail to keep them regularly, her daughter Barbara and her would become a tag team. And they would keep the diaries together. Usually Ida would start it. You can tell from her writing that her writing would essentially stop, it would trail off, and then Barbara would take over and write for her. So again, the whole idea of one person writing one diary isn't necessarily accurate. We have lots of other examples where family and friends wrote in each other's diaries. So it's more than just one person's world. The diaries capture social worlds. And that's really what got us interested in these diaries in the first place. So as I mentioned, because this is International Workers' Day, we'd like to share a bit about what these diaries reveal about the world of work and the world of labor. Now I'm going to turn it over to Michael.
Great, thank you everyone. Thank you for attending. Thank you for inviting us to participate. A couple of other things too that I wanted to mention. In many ways, I don't think Ida would have ever foreseen that she would be the subject of a book. I think she would be floored by this whole notion. And at the same time, however, I do think that Ida, because we often think of diaries as something that's secretive, but I think, and there's examples of this where Ida eventually thought that people would indeed be reading these diaries, because there are times where the family itself would go back, they would consult the diaries to check on particular birthdays or anniversaries. And as Bonnie just mentioned, she would also be co-writing the diary with her daughters. And from our perspective, we hope that this is the beginning of people reading her diaries. It is our hope that we still have the original diaries in a safety deposit box. They are in safekeeping, but we have made arrangements in the future that we will be donating the diaries to the Provincial Archives of New Brunswick, and we will be making them available in a digital form as well. We cannot release them yet. There are still a few, because there are some personal issues in the diaries that deal with extended family members who are still alive. And so I don't think it's still a little sensitive to, at this point, to release the diaries, but we hope to. And we hope that other people across the country, throughout the world, will consult, especially if they're digital, will consult these diaries and will look at them in many different ways. I mean, one thing that we've been doing a number of these discussions, we've also done a couple of podcasts for the book, and it's come up that one thing that we really missed when we were looking at these diaries is we didn't really do much on neighborhood and the development of West St. John in particular. And so that's something that, for example, an urban geographer could do a lot of interesting work with. So that just some added context for all of this. And as well, so that this book, yes, it is about Ida, but it's also about St. John and the different worlds that existed in St. John, one of them being work. So AR was a longshoreman. He also did other odd jobs, as it were. He also worked for a paving company because the longshoreman job was not a 365-day-a-year job, because it would depend on when ships were in port. He was, I think, a fairly proud member of the International Longshoremen's Association, Local 273 in St. John. And we'll show you an image of the port of St. John from this is, I believe, from 1953. Close that one. So this is from the port of St. John, we believe from 1953. And Ida's diaries reveal many aspects of organized labor and working class conflict in the diaries and in the port of St. John. Labor conflict in particular. Many instances where Ida recorded the longshoremen stopping work because they were angry with a number of things. They were angry about the fact that they were taking away their parking spaces and moving them further afield from the port, although in some cases AR was able to walk to the port. They went on strike for not receiving their checks. There was one famous incident, and we mentioned it in the book, where the parent company who was sending the money or sending them their checks was based in Montreal, and they sent them to the other St. John's, Newfoundland, not St. John, New Brunswick. And they were very upset, I think in part because A, they did not receive their pay, but B, how could you confuse the two? Yes, they're port cities, but also very, very different cities as well. They were also on strike over wages and working conditions. Being a longshoreman was a dangerous job. We have another image here that we'd like to share with you. This is from one of the local newspapers, and you could see the panel on the right-hand side, the hook that was used to grab the cargo. This was dangerous work, and AR was often injured on the job. They were often on strike over the issue of workplace safety as well. Now, in some instances, they took risks. AR took risks, perhaps unnecessary risks, and that has a lot to do with working class masculinity, which I'm going to talk about a little later. But now I'll hand it back to Bonnie.
Yes. One question we sometimes get is, why did you call the book Just the Usual Work? And that's actually a phrase from the diaries that occurs time and time again. One thing that we noticed when we were working with the diaries is that you really have to decode phrases, language. As I mentioned, it was very minimalist in what she did record. So if you get a phrase that's repeated over and over again, chances are that phrase is significant. And indeed, we think that that phrase is very significant. It refers to the daily labor that Ida Martin was involved in as a homemaker and as a person who sometimes worked in the paid labor force. What she would have meant by just the usual work, we think depended on the day of the week in which she would have said that. We were able to marry these phrases in the diary with some of the secondary literature on domestic labor in the post-war period. And we found that since the 19th century into the post-war period, there has been a lot of historians arguing that domestic labor was a daily and a seasonal activity. That on Monday you did the laundry, on Tuesday you did the cleaning up, On Sunday, you went right through the house and did everything again. In springtime, you did spring cleaning and you took off all the storm windows and so on. So we think that just these will work. I mean, sometimes she expands a little bit on what she's doing that day, but sometimes she just says just these will work. So that essentially reveals all of the work that she and her family did to get by. They were a working class family. They were hand to mouth sometimes. Ida did whatever she could to keep the family together. She essentially was the financial manager. She took care of all the income coming in. Sometimes she would even go down to the union office to pick up AR's checks because she wanted to make sure that the checks were used for the right purpose for the family's well-being. And I think Michael's going to talk a little bit about working class masculinity and some of the fears that she had that those checks would be used for other purposes besides the family. So yes, she was the financial manager. She in her possession, and we also have these, were all of the bank statements that she kept over the years. And some of my students down at UNB, we assigned this book for them for a review, and they were most surprised by the fact that a woman would be the financial manager. But she definitely was. She was the financial manager of the family. And that goes all the way back to the 19th century in working class families. Now, one of the chapters in our book, one of the first chapters, is the domestic family economy. And we talk about how families like Ida's and AR's and Barb's, how they got by from day to day. Part of it was what Ida did in the home, trying to keep life and limb together. Part of it was what AR was able to do as the main breadwinner. And of course, his work was seasonal, working at the port. So he also had to contribute through other odd jobs. Sometimes it was using dump trucks to haul fill to various places. He also worked as for a paving company as a paver. He also worked for a bootlegger at one point. He also cut down trees during Christmas time on Crown land and took them to King Square and sold them. So he made money that way. He was also a scrounger. We just heard a story that was shared by a friend of the family that AR would bring back boards that he collected from the port that nobody wanted. He would use his dump truck, go down, collect all the boards, bring them back, and bring them to this family who was very poor, didn't have a lot of resources. And that family essentially built their house from the boards that AR had scrounged. So that's another important part of the family economy. One last thing I'll mention in terms of the family economy is the exchange of labor. That AR, Barb, and Ida frequently exchanged labor with friends, with extended family members. That could mean having a relative do taxes, and in return, you help them wallpaper their room. It could be exchanging babysitting. There were many other instances where essentially Ida would accompany her sister-in-law to engage in various, to go to legal offices and to do various chores, and eventually that would be exchanged. So there was definitely a very important exchange of labor that also helped these families get by on a daily basis. And with that, I'll hand it over to Michael.
Perfect. Another element too of picking up on a point that Bonnie made earlier, another key conclusion that we want to make around the phrase "just the usual work" is that we want historians to think of diaries in different ways. In other words, we want historians to think of diaries as not just something you consult to maybe find out what the weather was like on a particular day. We want diaries, and we think, obviously we're biased, but we think the diaries are an integral part of revealing not just an individual's life, but the lives around them as well. So whether that's technological change, whether that's the rise, in Ida's case, of the welfare state post-World War II, the importance of unions in society. So we want diaries to become just the usual work of historians. So I encourage everyone here today as well, if you have family diaries, to maybe look at them in a different way, that these have the potential to be a treasure trove of information, not just about the actual diarist, but about the world itself. Because Ida would also, as she grew a bit older, and as technology like television came on stream, she started to look at the world around her as well. So these diaries were not necessarily, as Bonnie mentioned earlier, introspective. She was looking at things like faithfully following the royal family, for example, or the launch of Sputnik, the constitutional debates as well. So diaries are very useful tools that we encourage everyone to use when thinking about studying and writing about the past. Another element of the working class aspect of these diaries is the idea of working class masculinity. Now, we do know a fair amount about working class masculinity, but what makes these diaries, and I think, again, being biased as a co-author, fairly unique, is that we now have a woman's view of working class masculinity. So Ida kept very close dibs on AR, and she was able to critique, as I'm not sure she meant it as a way to be nasty, certainly not. So, but sometimes she would make fun of AR and his working class masculinity. And I'll just, again, we'll share an image from the newspaper. This is an image also that appears in the book, the Port of St. John. And this is the notion of AR didn't look like that, especially as he aged. He was not as fit as this image, but this was the idea of the working class man who was white and who was strong and fit. And while AR may have been, when he was younger, fit, he certainly did not look like this. And I don't think many people at the time looked like this, but this was the imagined notion of working class masculinity. But Ida would often look at this and critique AR, in some cases chiding him. For example, he loved to tinker, and he thought that he could fix anything and everything. He could fix the hot water tank, he could fix the car, he could fix the roof, in part because he felt that he didn't want to pay someone else to do what as a man, he should be able to do. But the problem was that he wasn't really as good of a fixer-upper as he thought he was. So he would try to fix the hot water tank, but he wouldn't be able to fix it. And Ida would write in her diaries that he's still tinkering at this and he still hasn't fixed it. And I wish that he would actually hire someone to fix the car or to fix the hot water tank. So she would chide him a bit on this. But another side of the working class masculinity, and Bonnie alluded to this earlier when she discussed the fact that Ida was the financial manager. AR did indulge in drinking, and that was part of working class masculinity as well. So when the job is done, you then go to the tavern, the local tavern, with your friends. And of course, Ida was a teetotaler. She viewed alcohol in a very negative way, I think in part because of her Baptist faith, but also because she saw alcohol as taking AR away from the family. So he would spend all day at work, and then he would spend a few more hours, in some cases longer, with his co-workers and drinking. And she would be writing in her diary saying that it's 2 a.m. and she's still wondering where he is. Why isn't he home? And this upset her a great deal. Again, not a lot, there were not a lot of emotions in the book, but the idea that alcohol is taking him away from the family. But that was also part of that working class masculinity. She also critiqued his risk-taking, which I mentioned before as well. Sometimes he would drive very erratically. When he was driving the dump trucks, we have a story where he would, in some cases, be drinking and driving, but not a lot, at least not that we're aware of. But he would, for example, use a stick of wood to press down on the accelerator and then just put his feet up on the dash and just relax while he's driving. This is not necessarily something that should be done, but that risk taking. And of course, there is, at one point, they were in a car accident, Ida and AR, because of his driving. And that was sort of a turning point. They were badly injured, not very seriously, but nonetheless. And that finally, I think, woke AR up, and he realized, okay, I've got to stop doing this. Because as he aged, he continued to engage in these acts of working class masculinity, in part to keep up with his younger co-workers. And because ultimately the job killed him. His body was broken by the time he died. And he probably died much younger than he needed to, because of the risks that he was taking on the job. And Ida would also chronicle the various injuries that he suffered at work. And again, sometimes these could have been prevented if he had been a little more careful and not trying to do what his younger co-workers could do. But again, it's part of that working class masculinity. And of course, Ida followed this, and she was concerned about it because she knew that he was the main breadwinner. So if something happened to him, then that was going to also, besides affecting him, it was going to affect the entire family as well. And that was something that also worried her a great deal. And I'm not sure to what extent AR realized that until he grew older. Right. And as he grew older, he started to realize this, and he stopped drinking. Yeah. He indeed embraced religion, although not the Baptist faith. So that was some tensions there, but nonetheless, he did engage in. He stopped drinking, found religion, and started to realize that he had missed key moments of his daughter's life as well, when he was not home, when he was drinking, or when he was driving, or when he was doing other jobs, in part to keep the family together, of course. But I think there was perhaps some regret on AR's part as he aged.
One thing too, I'd just like to add to that was, one thing we noticed as we were going through the diaries is, again, I mentioned that we needed to decode the diaries. One thing she kept saying was, AR bad today. He was bad today, really bad. And I really did not know what that meant initially. So I talked with my mother and contextualized the entries a bit more. And I come to find out that is when he was drinking. So again, she was using code in the diaries. Being bad meant drinking. And so that, growing up in that household, this would have been after he stopped drinking. I had no knowledge that any of this had occurred. So it was quite a revelation for me. And it helped me understand my mother a great deal more as well, because I could understand the history behind that aversion to alcohol. One other thing I'll just mention too, since we were talking about the reckless driving, is that we have one whole chapter on motor vehicles in the diaries. And this was probably the most surprising chapter, because that's not one thing that we would have necessarily thought would appear in the diaries of my grandmother. But they are consistent throughout. There are multiple mentions of cars, dump trucks, various motor vehicles. Now, partly they were a way to contribute to the family economy. As I mentioned, AR had an assortment of dump trucks that were used for odd jobs, so they were very important to the family economy. They were also an important part of working class masculinity, the whole idea of having a car and the status symbol, and quite frequently driving recklessly. But we also note in the diaries that, like a lot of women of her generation, Ida did not obtain her driving license until her 50s. So she went through a lot of anxiety learning how to drive. We deal with a concept called the nervous female driver that's in some of the literature. And she was one of those where a lot of the men around her who were trying to teach her how to drive, including AR, were making it a lot worse. Were probably, being very kind of condescending towards her as she learned how to drive. But eventually, because after that accident, AR decided not to drive anymore, ironically, she became the sole driver. So that was a large irony that someone who had been so nervous about driving, hadn't driven till she was in her early 50s, became the main driver. Now, after AR passed away and she was a widow, and we have a whole chapter on widowhood here as well, she really embraced the car as a symbol of mobility, of independence. In fact, she even refers to the car in her diaries. Like one entry was, the Chevy and I, had a good time, went up to Sussex, so she kind of personalizes the cars because they had such an important role as a mature woman, giving her a great deal of independence that she hadn't had before. So we thought that was an interesting part of the diaries as well.
One final thing that I'll mention, and then we can open it up to the chat or questions in terms of the working class element. The diaries in the book also help us to reveal the importance to working class families of the post-World War II welfare state. So the importance of Medicare, the importance of the family allowance, and how that helped working class families like Ida and AR and Barb stay above water. I mean, they were not wealthy, but they were also not extremely poor either. There was a lot of poverty around them, but they managed to, between the welfare state and then the importance of the Longshoremen's Union. So because they provided Ida with a pension, they helped to pay for AR's funeral. And so between the welfare state and the union, they managed to survive as a family. Because the other irony is that they never really owned anything that was new. So even though all of the new technology that was coming out, new dishwashers, washers and dryers, it was never new. Cars, the car was new to them, but it was never new. So in part because they couldn't afford it, but also because, and I think this goes back to the 19th century holdover, that if it was still working, why replace it? So if the hot water heater is still working, even though it might be 20 years old and AR still can't fix it properly, we're still not going to buy a new one. We don't see the need to have a new one for the sake of simply having a new one. So the cars were always new to them, but secondhand. All of the technology that they purchased was also secondhand. So it wasn't as if they were buying into, because the other element of the post-World War II era is the rise of consumer culture. Yes. And they never literally and figuratively bought into that because of their finances, but also because it didn't necessarily appeal to them as well. But even the televisions that they had were, again, new to them, but not new. Ida was captivated by it, as was AR. But at the same time, it was part of using multiple pieces, the welfare state, the union, and then the salary. And then, as Bonnie mentioned earlier, bartering. All of this was to keep home and hearth together. And it was a constant struggle. I mean, again, they did not live in abject poverty, but there were many times where Ida would worry about, well, where's the next paycheck going to come? And if the port was slowing down, then okay, where can we pick up other work? So that's why, as Bonnie mentioned, AR would do perhaps some illegal activities like working with a bootlegger or cutting down trees on Crown land, or maybe even on the Irving-owned land and selling them at Christmas. All of this is illegal activity, but it's also a way to keep home and hearth together.
Great. Well, I think that we're going to stop there to see if you have any questions.
Okay, well, thank you. This is, I'm fascinated by this whole project, and I put a link to the book in chat in case people are interested in purchasing it. And I also put a link to the Journal of New Brunswick Studies. Like I said, a great resource. And I would like to, on behalf of the Keswick Ridge Historical Society, offer my condolences to Bonnie on the loss of your mother last year. Yeah, I think I remember her attending the presentation when the New Brunswick Historical Society, and how proud she looked, you know, how glad she was to hear about her mom and about her diaries. So okay, so we do have some questions in chat, and I will begin. Scroll back. And the first question is, does Ida ever give much of a hint as to who she imagined reading her diary? Not in the real world, but rhetorically. Is there a sense, for instance, of what she was assuming her reader assumed or valued?
Good question. I have to think about that. Well, she knew that her family was reading them. So she would probably assume that some of her family members would share the same values. And also that's why, as Bonnie mentioned earlier, she would use code. So, for example, and Bonnie, you can elaborate on this because it's a great story, but she would often use Madam Queen.
Yes, indeed. There, in a few instances, she refers to one of her female relatives, her sister-in-law, in fact, as Madame Queen. And when you actually see the handwriting, the handwriting is different whenever she discusses this particular person. It trails off. It doesn't even finish. And so we take that to mean that this was a person she did not like.
Yes, indeed.
Right? So we notice a change in her writing style sometimes, or her handwriting, which show us that contains some of the emotion of how she views those particular people. Now, one thing that she does as well, it doesn't really speak to Russ's question, which is a really good one. And it's one we haven't really thought about in that rhetorical sense. She does engage with herself as a reader, which is interesting. So she'll go through, for example, as I mentioned earlier, and edit previous entries, but she'll also talk to herself. She'll go up and she'll say, this didn't happen this day, it happened this other day. Or she might say, what was that one I was thinking about? She said, well, her brother had an operation in the hospital, and she crosses it out and says, no, he didn't. So she's dialoguing with herself as both the writer and the reader. So we thought that was kind of interesting.
And then she also when we thought that there would also be more engagement after when AR died. So that she would be talking more about that and her relationship with AR. And surprisingly or not, that didn't happen quite as much. She wasn't dialoguing with herself, but a few times she would. And again, it's the economy of words, where one time she just used one very simple but yet poignant word, alone. And so it was her way of trying to come to terms with being alone, even though she still had her daughter and her part of her family. But AR, despite all of his foibles, was there through thick and thin, and now he wasn't. And so she's also trying to assess how to grapple with his loss. Yeah.
And one other thing I was thinking of too, with Russ's point, just one last thing is, I think she was kind of using the idea of the book as a model in terms of writing her diaries, because I mean, she wrote sort of the typical diary entries, but then at the end, she had what we might otherwise call an index, where you'd go to the back and she listed what she thought were the most important things to happen in those 5 years. And so you go back. It's very interesting to see what she chose to write about. It could vary from the Pope being shot to a new TV bulb being replaced. It transitions between the real world, the real daily grind, and the world out there. So we thought it was interesting that she's kind of using that kind of book model of the index to get the reader to go back into the diaries again to look for these things.
Yeah.
So that's kind of interesting.
Yeah. And it also was, I also viewed it as a way for her to remind herself what she thought was important, so that if she was searching for something,
Yes,
this index, in our word, not
hers,
necessarily, but she could then go back and say, oh yes, that's where it happened, or yes, that was the key part that happened in that 1 year.
Yeah.
So yeah, I thought that was very fascinating and very helpful for us.
Yes.
Again, it's almost as if she was anticipating people like us, and of course, and we forgot to mention that Ida willed the diaries to Bonnie.
yes.
So, and she knew that Bonnie was actively pursuing post-secondary education. Indeed, she
Supported me.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
She even when Bonnie did her PhD at Dalhousie, when Bonnie graduated with her PhD, Ida bought her PhD robes for her. So very, very, very proud in that sense.
Yeah.
So, and she knew that she was studying history all throughout, although you started as a sociologist and then saw the light. Saw the light and came over to history. But so I think as the quote unquote more objective one, because I never met AR, and I only managed to meet Ida once before she passed. So for me, there is a bit more objectivity. So I'm able to pull back and look more broadly at what's happening. But the fact that she willed them to Bonnie, in my mind, is a cue to say, you're the historian.
You make something.
You make something of this. You might find these really interesting. Again, would she have anticipated the book? Probably not. But I think she was certainly keen to have someone with an historical background or training look at these. Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. Oh, Russ got his hand up, but I had the same question too about her editing her own writing. Like, I kept thinking, why would a person do that if they didn't anticipate somebody going to see it later on? And
Well, we did consult the diaries at family conversations. So if we were having dinner and somebody said, when was Hatfield out of power? Can't remember. It was sometime in the 80s. Let's go check Graham's diaries. So we trundle upstairs, get the diary, pull it off, and try to find it, like an encyclopedia, sort of. So she knew that every now and then we were tipping into the diaries to find stuff. So she there was kind of an assumption, I think, that some family members were going to be viewing these. Maybe not Madame Queen, but immediate ones. Immediate family.
I was wondering if whether AR read the diaries. I was a little surprised when you said that other people were reading the diaries as she wrote them. Normally, I think of diaries as the kinds of things that are kind of for the writer herself.
Yeah, exactly.
And in this case, it seems clearly to have been a more public. But when she says AR was bad today, they are read that?
I don't get the sense that he did. But we have, if he did, then that was something she did not record.
Yeah.
So I didn't
don't
get
think she-
I didn't get a
I don't think
sense that. But again, if she did, then yes, she would have kept that from us. That she would not have let us know. But maybe he was. But if he was, he didn't learn anything from them.
Well, I think what they are too. I would like to know. I would love to be able to sit AR down and chat with him more now.
Yes.
I
Yeah.
loved him a lot. He was a funny guy. But I wish I'd talk more about him, about his past life. But that's always the way, isn't it? But I think for AR, he probably viewed diary keeping as, oh, that's what the woman did. That's, I'm not interested in that. It's not part of who I am or my working class masculinity. But I think there's also a literacy issue. And I think that's maybe why Ida was the financial keeper as well. I think she was more literate than he was in that sense. So yeah, but that is a really good question. I never thought about that. Did he ever view them? I doubt it.
Yeah, as do I. But then again, he
Who
could
knows?
have, but if so, he still kept tinkering.
Yeah. Maybe he wanted to show her.
Yeah, no, well, exactly.
Okay, all right. James has a
Whether-
question. Are you aware of the diary project at Guelph University, earlier time
Yes.
period, settler?
Yes,
Their
yes.
bartering may have been a holdover from the self-sufficiency period.
definitely. Yeah, definitely. There is that overlap with the 19th century. Yes, this idea of self-sufficiency, of doing it yourself. And there was a bit of pride in that as well, of a bit of pride, a bit of stubbornness, I think, on AR's part as well. But yes, that is definitely a holdover. Yes, and the project at Guelph is, they're doing a lot of important work at the University of Guelph.
Settler diaries.
Yes.
One thing too that sort of overlaps with that Guelph project is that Ida came from a rural environment, right? So we think part of that family economy that's operational in St. John is also part of the rural family economy that she would have grown up with on the farms of all kinds. So she's bringing that rural sensibility of self-sufficiency and working constantly like you have to do on a farm, right? She's bringing that with her. The whole family is, as they're transplanted into an urban environment. So the interface between rural and urban, I think, is very fluid.
Yeah, very much so.
In these diaries, yeah.
And then picking up on the idea of self-sufficiency and blatant self-promotion here, but I also have edited a collection of essays called Exploring the Dimensions of Self-Sufficiency for New Brunswick, and we have a chapter in that. So that's also something that a book that people might be interested in. I probably did that about 10 years ago now. So because we've been working on this project
for a long time,
for far too long. That's why we were very glad that we were able to have the book published before Barb, Bonnie's mom, left us, because it was very important for her to read it. She struggled at times with reading the book, especially revisiting AR's drinking, because that was part of her childhood and growing up and him being away from the home. So she struggled with it at times, and she was honest with us about that. But she also knew that we are professional historians. And that's why we went with McGill Queen's University Press as well. So she knew that we were going to take a critical look at it. We weren't going to embarrass anyone. No. That was certainly not our intention, and hopefully we haven't. I don't think so. We still receive Christmas cards, so I don't think we've from the family. So I don't think we've alienated anyone yet, but yes, so it is definitely part of that self-sufficiency. Yeah, excellent. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Unmute myself. Jane also goes on to say, delightful presentation. Ida was very proud of you. Loved the way you played off each other. Thank you, Jane.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yep. Another question.
And Susan has a question. Did Ida include other details in her diary, like the weather that day, keeping track of money coming in and money going out?
Yes.
Yes.
Good question. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, definitely. Sometimes in the diaries, like in the front pages, she uses them for financial transactions.
Yeah.
So you can kind of see her using whatever blank spaces she could find in the diaries for financial stuff. So definitely she used them for that. Other stuff too, yeah. What were some of the other things?
Oh, yes,
everything. You can imagine.
recording the weather, recording
TV shows.
TV shows, hockey games.
Yeah.
It's in some cases stereotypically Canadian in that regard, but also as we mentioned, the constitutional debates. So the
Yeah.
repatriation of the Constitution. She mentioned in the diaries that Ida wrote each of the premiers, wrote letters to each of the premiers expressing her views about the repatriation. Sadly, we've not been able to find those letters. So if indeed she did do that, those letters they're gone. Or at least gone in terms of we've contacted archives across the country. We've contacted the Library and Archives Canada in Ottawa, different provincial premiers' offices and their papers to see if they're there. But I suspect letters like that, sometimes they just don't, they just fall by the wayside, but they would have been wonderful to have read and would have been a nice complement to part of the book. Yeah. But yes, and then of course, Lady Diana.
Well, one of our chapters, the one on the political engagement, that kind of deals with what we see as a real change in the diaries, like probably 1960s onward. Once mass media hits and people, I mean, they're already listening to the radio, but once they start watching television on a more regular basis, you see her world getting bigger and bigger, right? So whereas before she was mostly talking about, you know, what they had done that day as a family or who she'd visited or, you know, what the weather was like. But more and more she was talking about the space race. She followed the mining accident in Spring Hill. The patriation debates were really big. She watched all the elections that she could. She was a political junkie by the 1980s. So we found that really interesting that a life, you can see how a life gets bigger while the diaries she's writing are also getting bigger, and they kind of feed off of each other that way.
And AR worked for the provincial progressive conservatives. So in that sense, he too was a bit of a political activist. I think politically they were conservative in their political views, but also in their social views, despite AR's quote unquote labor radicalism. I don't think AR would have seen himself as a labor radical. I don't think so. And I don't think I would describe him as such, but nonetheless, when there was an issue at the port that he and his co-workers took issue with, they also stood up for themselves. So now they weren't burning the port or they weren't doing anything like that. But at the same time, as we mentioned, AR also broke the law. I mean, these were petty crimes, but so there is that juxtaposition as well. Socially conservative, yes, but if you have to cut down some trees on Crown land to get some extra money for Christmas, so be it. Work for a bootlegger. And of course, that's really problematic when given Ida's views about that as well and about alcohol. So that was not good at all. But AR didn't seem to have any qualms about that as well. So yeah.
I'll mute myself. Yeah, I don't see any more questions in chat. I had written down a number of questions for myself, as you can see, handwritten all over the place. But I think I'm just going to have to buy the book and see if my questions are answered there. And if not, I'll be in touch.
Definitely.
Yeah, lots of questions, and some of them were answered, some weren't. But this is great, and this has been a wonderful presentation. And thank you for taking the time to share your passion with us today. And like I said, I'm going to go purchase the book right after this. Hopefully have time to read it. But yeah, and so just a reminder that Jane's has her hand up. We'll get to Jane's before we conclude. Jane's, did you have a question?
No, I was trying to clap.
Oh,
Virtual clap. Thank you.
Virtual clapping. Thank you, Jane. I would too.
Great. Thank you
Okay.
very much we love to talk about this, as you know. So we're really happy to share our research, and
Definitely.
there's so much more in the diaries than we were ever able to talk about. So we're really hoping that, as Michael mentioned, other people will have a go at them as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
With entirely different lenses.
Yes, no, exactly. From a literary perspective, from an urban geographer, might have a field day with these as well. Political scientists.
Yes.
Yeah, we're hoping that we hope that our book is the beginning, not the end. So we do not see this as the definitive statement on the diary. Certainly not, because so many different people can look at them in so many different ways, because they are so rich, in part because they're so voluminous and for such a long period. Oftentimes you find diaries that are just runs for 3 years or 4 years, but these are for decades and every day. So in that sense, so faithful. But if she did miss days, which she did, she would go back and try to restructure or reconnect with the diaries, and sometimes it wouldn't always be accurate because she would forget. And as Bonnie mentioned earlier, as she aged, it was a little more difficult for her. And back to the earlier question too, but other things she wrote down, she also talked about aging.
Yes.
And what it was like to be a widow, what it was like to then, she eventually had to leave the family home and move into a care facility, and how difficult that was, because they had lived in that home for so long, and it was a point of pride for them to have that home. And the home itself still stands in St. John. It's still there.
It's a little rough around the edges.
It is a little, but it's still there. So we drive by it occasionally when we're in St. John. But so yes, and so that's very, because we have a chapter on aging and widowhood as well. But her transition, while difficult at first, I think she continued to thrive as a widow. She also found the 2 care homes that she was in were very good to her. She was very fortunate, because we hear now, with the last few years, all of the horrors that have been occurring in long care assisted living facilities. That was not her case, and they were very, very good to her. Even some of the staff would attended her funeral. So she really connected. So she transitioned as best as anyone can transition into widowhood and aging. She did it, I think, gracefully.
What a wonderful woman to get to wish I had known. And Jane had one final comment about
nutritionist. Yes, indeed.
Nutritionist.
Indeed.
Oh,
indeed. Hadn't thought about that, but of course, that's why we hope that these will be available, hopefully within a couple of years. Because it's difficult. We don't want certain people to die.
No.
Before we can deposit them. That literally has to happen. So, and we make provisions in our wills as well, so that if something happens, they will also be deposited. So because these are too rich just to keep ourselves. I mean, it's for as someone who battles with access to information constantly, the notion that they're just sitting in a safety deposit box doesn't sit well with me, because we want more people to read them, but we have to wait for at least for a few more years.
The time will come. We'll keep our eyes on that.
Indeed.
Okay. Well, again, thank you.
Yes, thank you.
And this is our final installment for this year in our History Speaks series 2022. Thank you everyone who has attended today and for your support of the Keswick Ridge Historical Society all along. And next year, join us again. We'll have another new series. And remember to like us on Facebook and to stay up to date with all of our future news and events. And we're always looking for new members. We meet monthly, usually by Zoom. So send us an email if you'd like to more information on that, or message us on our Facebook. And Jane just had one more final comment. I'm just checking. No, I think. Oh, sorry. yeah, and again, thank you for Dr. Boudreau and Dr. Huskins for bringing this to us today. And like I said, I'm going to order the book as soon as we're done our speaker series, and
Perfect. Thank
We
you.
would love that. Thank you very much.
and then find time to
Thanks
read
so
it. That might take a few years. Very busy. All right. So
Thanks very
again,
much.
okay, again.